Hey, what's up everyone? So this week it's a new video with a guest and I'm very glad to have Marina with me. Welcome Marina.
Hi, happy to be here.
So Marina, you've been curating a newsletter called iOS Code Review for what has it been like a bit more than a year, I think now.
Yeah, I started in the summer last year. Yeah, that's really exciting. I'm so happy to be sharing tips that I find across the internet every 2 weeks.
And that's the reason why I asked you if you wanted to do a video with me, is because over these months of curating the newsletter, I'm sure you found out a lot of super useful tips. And I asked you, like, could you put together, like, I don't know, five, six, 10 that we can share with the audience? You said yes, here we are. And so let's get started.
Yes, let's do it. So the first tip is about Combine and Erect Swift. A lot of the times when we subscribe to publishers or observables and add the subscriptions to cancellables array on the object or to a dispose bag in Erect Swift, we forget to add a weak self, and then it creates a retain cycle with a view controller or a view model where the subscription is created. So this was a small tip a few months ago where Iniko here reminded us that it's good to add weak self to all the subscription closures on publishers.
Yeah, and that one is really
Mhm.
crazy because for me, I think it's one of the most unsafe syntax of Swift, because here in the line that is in red, you are capturing self implicitly. The compiler doesn't give you a warning, doesn't force you to explicitly write self like it would inside a closure, but still the retain cycle is there. So it's incredibly tricky, this one.
Yeah, especially that for this kind of syntax. Yeah, exactly. And even when we use just regular mapping or subscription closures, there's so many of these closures in our apps that it's easy to forget in one of them or two of them to write the weak self, and that can create huge retain cycles and huge memory issues for the app. Just that one tiny 4-character thing. So I think that's a really great tip to remember for everyone using reactive frameworks.
Definitely agree.
All right, let's move to the next one. All right, so the next tip is about using the Swift type system to make your code safer and avoid accidental mistakes. Here's an example of how we can use a type safety feature of Swift and generics to avoid accidental mistakes of passing the wrong ID of the wrong object to another one. Here, Majid is suggesting that we can, instead of plain strings or integers as identifiers on objects, we can define this little wrapper type that we can use instead of an identifier on the object. And that way you can't accidentally pass an ID of a user to ID of a record in your code base when you're implementing some feature for your app. There's a similar example that Donnie shared that uses the built-in identifiable type. Then it gives you a type alias called user.id that you can use to make it clear in the function parameters what kind of parameter are you passing here.
I think I saw that one at the time, and I really liked it because since it relies on something that is already in the standard library and that, for instance, with UI apps already have to use, I feel like it's very easy to start using it, and there's not that much of a friction, I would say. So, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, it's really nice that now Swift UI has introduced this built-in identifiable protocol. Before you would sometimes add your own, maybe even with the same name, and now you don't have to. So here's another example of how we can use Swift type safety and type strictness in our code. Many of you have probably already done it, but I think it's a really cool thing to repeat anyway. And it is to use enums instead of multiple Boolean properties to minimize the amount of state that your class or your code can have. So in this example here, I defined 3 different states, and one could even argue that idle state sometimes isn't needed. So my view can be only in these 2 states and not possibly loading, has data, and all the different combinations of that if that was defined by optional properties or Boolean properties. And then we can just switch on these cases and set the UI into the state, avoiding having to handle cases that couldn't really happen, but what if they do? And then you're kind of wondering what your code will do in those cases. This way we can just minimize it and just switch on those. And I have an example here that I'm going to open up. And we're going to look at another tip on how to improve this code, in my opinion, how this could be made nicer. But for now, this is an example of how you would switch on the state property and then just define your view based on the current state, avoiding the edge cases that will not happen.
And I think I've definitely written code that looks like this. And as you said, it's not the best, but it's already better than having a method like go to loading, go to data that assumes that the previous method had been called and had already done its side effect. At least here, for each case, you have all the labels getting a clear value for the incident property, which is already a nice thing.
Yeah, and this also gets closer to how we do things in Swift UI, where the UI is directly dependent on state, or even as a function of state in Swift UI. And also, if you already built your models like this, or view models like this, then it makes it that much easier to switch to Swift UI for your UI layer, shall you want to do that, because then you just build a body of your Swift UI view based off the same states that you already have from the domain level. So now let's have a look at another example here in the same piece of code, and that's the late let initialization. That can help us to make this piece of code a little bit nicer and avoid potential mistakes as well. So here we have lots of repetitive code, and it's easy to forget to set one of these hidden properties, which would result in showing a half updated view that shouldn't be showing. We could forget to one of the lines completely, or mix up the true and false, because it's really hard to read. We can also make many mistakes here. Basically, the more logic there is, the more views there is, the more mistakes one could make, especially when changing things and adding new views and so on.
Definitely.
Yeah, I've definitely had bugs that I've spent a bunch of time chasing for a little.
I think
true
everyone
and
has,
false.
especially since when you have that kind of code, you tend, when you add something new, to duplicate the previous code, and you forget to rename only one thing, and that's how you get a very weird bug, because it all looks the same. And I can imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And it all looks the same, and it's so hard to read as well because of that. So not only bugs, but there's also an issue with readability in this example. And this is just 3 labels. It's nothing crazy, and some views are way more complex than this. So I have a little alternative. I didn't want to do live refactoring on the recording because there's quite a few lines. So I'm going to just show you the alternative version, which in my view is a bit more readable. So let's declarations. They are immutable and they can only be initialized once. But perhaps it's a less known fact that the initialization can happen later. So you don't have to write equals true or something right away. It can happen later, but it still can happen only once. And the compiler is really smart here, and it can detect and check that each of these variables here has been initialized only once and not more than once, and it wasn't forgotten. So for example, here, if I forget to set it in one case, then the compiler will tell us. So now it says that show spinner is used before it's been initialized, because we forgot to initialize it in one of the branches of the switch. And the switch is exhaustive, so it lists all of the cases here. And the same thing happens if we, by accident, assign it second time. Then it will the same way tell us that we cannot assign it second time because it is immutable, so we can't mutate it. And also, by using the variables, you can make it a bit more readable, especially if some of the views need just not only a hidden property, but perhaps some other thing, depending on the hidden or shown. And also you can then do something that's more understandable to me is the positive thing, like should it be shown, and then the hidden one is always reversed, so it's kind of hard to wrap my head around that when trues and falses have to be reversed here.
And it's a really nice trick, because like when you sent me your list, that was the only one, I think, this late let initialization, where I wasn't sure what it would look like. But now that I see it, I definitely see the value in it. And this is much safer than the previous one. And there is arguably not that much overhead, honestly. Like the positive outweighs the negative by a lot. So pretty great trick.
Yeah, cool. I'm really glad you like it. And I can show also another example where the same late let initialization can help. And this is in like a callback kind of multi-step logic where you'd use guards and return results. And I have that on the web. So let us switch to that. So here we have another example where a late initialization can help us make less mistakes. Here we have a URL session and a data task loading some data from the network, and then calling a completion closure with a result, which could be a failure, or if we parse the result correctly, that would be a success case. So here, the late initialization together with a defer will help us avoid calling completion twice or initializing results incorrectly or multiple times. So here we define it first without a value, and then we set up that the defer, which will be executed on every return of the function, then we'll call the completion in the end. And then in the happy case path, or we're actually not using guards here, but even without guards, I think it reads really nicely. It will assign the result once or return, again, assign the result only once and return. So this will check even inside the defer, even inside all of these if let closures, the compiler will check that the result is only assigned once. And if we forget to assign result in any of these cases, which will result in completion not being able to be called because there would be nothing to return normally if we wrote it without the defer, then here the compiler will check everything for us, that the completion is called, that the result is assigned only once. So it's a really nice pattern, I think, for these kind of calls with completion closures.
Yeah, it's really nice to see like this double check. First, you make sure that there is always a result, and then you make sure that it is always returned, because that's the big, like you said, that's the big caveat with completion handlers, is that if you forget to call them, the compiler won't notice it, and it's so easy when you start to have like error cases to forget one. I know that it can be often a question on interviews, for instance, trying to see if there is a code path on which the completion handler fails to be called, and honestly, like showing that as an answer, like we can even like rely on the compiler so that it doesn't happen. That's pretty nice. Like honestly, I didn't know about that one, and I'm definitely going to send it to my colleagues tomorrow morning, because I see a lot of value in that trick.
Awesome. And this is where Swift, I think, is an awesome language. I think I really enjoy it, but it also is a nice and a great tool for helping us build better apps.
Yeah.
Where it really saves us a lot of hassle in some cases. So the next tip is about UIKit and how to do layout. I wanted to tell you about a neat API that exists in UIKit that not many people in my experience have heard of, and it is layout margins. You've probably heard or saw this property on views that is called layout margins or layout margins guide. And that seems like just some padding, like 8 points from each side. That's the default one, the default values. But it is actually way more powerful than that. And then I wanted to show you what you can do with it. So by using layout margins and this little property, a really tiny property called preserve superview layout margins to set to true, we can get the views, the subviews of a view inherit layout margins from its parent. So here in this little demo recording, there's the view controller that gets its layout margins from the safe area, and the navigation bar gets its layout margins from the safe area, and this is built in and works by default. And then here I've added a small view on top, which has the white area attached to layout margins, and so the red is the rest of the view. And this little view has one property set on it, preserve superview layout margins. And what it starts doing is it starts increasing its own layout margin as it moves to the side of the screen. So the text or the layout, whatever views you add, are always aligned with the navigation bar. And that way you can achieve really nice alignment on things in your UI without hard coding values or doing custom calculations. All of this is completely built in UIKit in the framework.
And when I see it like this, it feels very much like SwiftUI once again, because you have like views being nested into one another and inheriting the size of the parents. So yeah, a nice way to put your SwiftUI and your UIKit code as close as possible.
Yeah, definitely. And this is the implementation of this little view. It's the same class of the view that's used both in the view controller and this little view that gets moved. It just has a label that is attached to layout margins guide and its anchors, as opposed to just view dot leading anchor or view dot trailing anchor uses the layout margins guide. And only on the view controller, the only thing you need to do, I mean, aside, I have, of course, the settings and subview adding and things. The only thing you really need to do is enable this preserve super view layout margins on the subviews that you're adding, and they will start inheriting your view controller's layout margins.
That's pretty cool. I don't think I've used it. I don't have any memory of it, but now, like next time I see the opportunity, I will give it a try. And because I think it can, like you said, like simplify some very complex like set of constraints.
Cool. Yeah, and it's available from iOS 9, so you can use it in all the projects with iOS 11 plus or iOS 12 plus.
I'm lucky. The app I work on is iOS 15 minimum. We dropped iOS 14, so I'm with like the very lucky people.
That's so awesome. That's so awesome. And this is why these APIs don't get sometimes adopted, because as they are released, you have to you have to support older versions that are not where you can't use it yet. And then 2 years later, when you can use it, you already forgot about all those new APIs introduced 2 years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so for the next tip, let's switch to Xcode, and that would be the last tip for today.
So we are back in Xcode.
Yeah, and I have another example here that's related to UIKit, and it's about managing assets. So what I want to show you is a nice way to organize your assets in the project, and also to test them to make sure that none of the images are missing and none of the strings, because you can use that for localizable strings as well, that none of your assets are nil because the name of the string is misspelled or it got accidentally deleted from the project or something like that. So the way I like to organize my images is to create an enum listing all of the images that I'm going to use in the project. And you could do that both for custom images included in the assets, like I did here, or you could also do it for SF symbols that you're using throughout the app. And then just declare a little extension to get the actual image corresponding to that. In this way, you list all of the artwork that you use in the app in one place, so it's easy and nice to have an overview. Or when you add a new case, you could see in Git when a new row was added or modified. So that way you have some track record of a better overview of the track record of the state of your artwork. But another bonus with this approach is that you can actually test it. So just by adding case iterable conformance to these enums, we get an all cases variable listing all of these cases, and we can just iterate over them and assert in tests that the corresponding image is available, and then throw a nice error failure if the image is not available, and then you'll immediately see, image with that name is missing, as opposed to accidentally then later maybe finding out that somewhere the button doesn't have an icon during a manual test.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, because I was thinking when you were showing it that we could alternatively, if the image is nil, before we return nil, put like an assertion failure that will only crash while you are in development. But if you have a test, it's even better, because the test will be run every time. Whereas if your image that is missing is on like a remote screen that you don't access it too often, it might go unnoticed for very long, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you might not notice that. And with because changing the assets usually is, or always is, part of the project and is part of pull requests, so it connects nicely with the setup where you run tests on every pull request or on every release.
Yeah, and for this, so I use SwiftGen on my end to basically generate the enums or the strokes for me. And now I'm curious to see if there is a way to generate the same test with SwiftGen and with as little code as you've written.
Mm-hmm. That would be cool. And also, this approach can be used for localizable strings, which I think SwiftGen also supports, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Basically listing your localized keys here. You can also make little functions for cases when your localized string takes a parameter, like for example, countable things like 5, photos or something like that, you can make cases with associated values instead of, you wouldn't be able to do it directly like this with row representable, but still you can make it very nice with enums with associated values for more complex strings and organize then the strings that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the strings is definitely like that one file that grows at a size where you can forget about a human keeping it, like making sure that it's working. It's too big, so you definitely need to rely on this kind of techniques to make sure you can actually trust this big strings file.
Yeah, especially for many languages where you could add a string to one file and then it doesn't get added to another file, where there could be mismatch between the languages, and then you can't test all the languages manually. But with this, you can have multiple test targets, like with different test configurations, where you run the tests from the perspective of different locales, and then that way you can verify that all the strings are present on all locales.
All right, thanks a lot, Marina, for sharing all these tips with us. Like I said in the intro, you run a newsletter called iOS Code Review. Maybe you want to tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I've started the newsletter a year ago, and now it's been 32 issues since. Every 2 weeks, I share 5 or 6 code improvement tips, or sometimes tools that help you make your code better, that I find across the internet, Twitter, and the articles. But I try to make it so it's a bite size, so you can get the value of it from the email itself, and then you don't necessarily have to go into each link and read a longer article. So it's like a short format where you can learn something in an easy way, and improve as a developer. So come along, join at ioscodereview.com if you want to join. Otherwise, you can also follow on Twitter, ios_code_review, and I post even more things there.
I agree that it's a very nice format, and I've been subscribed to this newsletter, like not from the very start, but I guess from the first few issues. So I highly recommend that you also subscribe to it. All the links are in the description, whether you prefer Twitter or email. You've got all the links in the description. And I think I just have to say thanks again, Marina, for joining me for this video.
Thank you so much for having me. I was really excited to talk with you and to share some things that I've learned.
Thank you for watching, and see you next time.